I fold the newspaper and place it on my coffee table, but Marshall's face won't stop staring up at me from the obituary photo. 34 years old. The article says he died from complications related to substance abuse, which is a polite way of saying he drank himself to death. His mom gave them a picture from high school, before everything went wrong, before that night destroyed all of us. My hands tremble as I grab my coffee mug. The liquid's gone cold, but I drink it anyway because I need something to do with my mouth besides scream. Marshall Lynch, dead at 34. I haven't thought about him in years. That's a lie. I think about him every day, but I've gotten good at shoving those thoughts aside before they can dig in. Now his obituary sits in my living room like an accusation, and I can't pretend anymore. The memories come rushing back whether I want them or not. I'm 12 again, sitting in Lloyd Peterson's basement on a Friday night in October. Lloyd's parents had driven up to his aunt's cabin for the weekend, leaving us kids alone for the first time ever. We felt so grown up, so free. Lloyd had found a six-pack of beer tucked behind his dad's workbench, and we'd each forced down half a can, trying not to wince at the bitter taste. My dad would kill me if he knew we were drinking his beer, Lloyd had said, but he was grinning when he said it. Marshall had laughed and let out a loud burp. What he doesn't know won't hurt him. That was Marshall, always pushing boundaries, always testing how much he could get away with. Even at 12, he had this magnetic confidence that made the rest of us want to follow him anywhere. His red hair stuck up in cowlicks no matter how much he tried to slick it down, and he had this crooked grin that showed up whenever he was planning something we probably shouldn't do. Phoenix Webster sat cross-legged on the basement floor, surrounded by library books and photocopied newspaper articles. He'd been researching local ghost stories for weeks, collecting them like other kids collected baseball cards. His long black hair fell across his face as he read, and every few minutes he'd look up and share some creepy detail he'd found. "Listen to this," Phoenix had said that night, holding up a yellowed newspaper clipping. "The Hartwell house on Elm Street has been empty since 1952. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell hanged herself in the attic after her husband died in Korea. The family just walked away and left everything inside." Brody Jones pushed his glasses up his nose, a nervous habit that got worse whenever Phoenix started talking about ghosts. Why would they leave everything? Because the house is cursed, Phoenix said matter-of-factly. Mrs. Hartwell wasn't the first person to die there. I found records going back to the 1800s. Suicides, accidents, mysterious deaths, all connected to that house. I remember sitting on Lloyd's old couch, my legs tucked under me, feeling excited and terrified at the same time. The basement smelled like sawdust and motor oil from Mr. Peterson's workshop, and the single overhead bulb threw strange patterns on the concrete walls. Outside, October wind rattled the small basement windows. "You're making that up," Marshall had said, but his voice cracked a little. Phoenix spread out more newspaper clippings like he was dealing cards. "Am not. Look at this. 1923. A whole family found red dead in their beds. 1934. A man shot himself in the kitchen. 1947. Twin girls drowned in the bathtub. All in the same house." "That's impossible," Brody whispered. "The neighbors say you can see lights in the attic windows at night," Phoenix continued, "and Mrs. Patterson from down the street swears she saw a woman's shadow moving around up there last month." Lloyd leaned forward, his blue eyes going wide. "No way." "Way. And get this, every single person who died in that house was found with their eyes wide open, like they'd seen something so terrifying it literally scared them to death." I felt goosebumps rise on my arms. "Stop it, Phoenix. You're freaking me out." But Marshall had gotten up, puffing out his chest the way he did when he wanted to prove how brave he was. "I'm not scared of some stupid ghost story." "Neither am I," Lloyd said quickly. "Me neither," Brody added, though his voice was barely above a whisper. Phoenix looked at each of us in turn, his dark eyes serious. "Then let's go check it out." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. I remember my stomach dropping, that mix of terror and excitement that comes when someone dares you to do something you absolutely shouldn't do. "You mean actually go to the house?" I asked. "Tonight," Phoenix said. "It's only 6 blocks away. We could walk there through the old cemetery, check it out, and be back before midnight." Marshall's smile spread across his face. "I'm in." "Me too," Lloyd said. Brody nodded reluctantly. "If everyone else is going." They all looked at me. I wanted to say no. Wanted to suggest we just watch movies and eat popcorn like normal kids. But I also didn't want to be the scared little girl who ruined their adventure. "Okay," I heard myself say. "But just to look at it from outside." Phoenix had laughed. "Sure, Melody, just from outside." But I could tell from the way he said it that he was already planning something more. I set down my coffee mug and walked to my apartment window. 30 years later, and I can still taste that cheap beer, still smell the sawdust in Lloyd's basement, still feel the excitement that had crackled between us as we planned our midnight adventure. Marshall Lynch is dead. The kid who pushed us all to be braver than we felt, who pulled us into the darkness with that lopsided smile and reckless laugh, died alone in a hospital bed, his liver wrecked by decades of trying to forget. I know what he was trying to forget. The same thing I've been running from for 30 years. The same thing that'll keep me staring at the ceiling tonight, just like it has every night since we were 12 years old and believed nothing could touch us. I pick up the newspaper again and stare at Marshall's young face in the obituary photo. "I'm sorry," I whisper to the empty room. "I'm so sorry I left you there." But even as I say it, I know sorry isn't enough. It never has been. And now Marshall's gone, and I'm still here, still living with what happened that night when 4 kids decided to test their courage against something that should have been left alone. I can still see Lloyd's backpack sitting on his basement workbench, crammed with supplies like we were heading out on some grand expedition instead of sneaking through a graveyard to break into an empty house. He'd packed everything with the serious focus of a kid who'd watched too many adventure movies. 3 flashlights with extra batteries, a coil of rope he'd snagged from his dad's garage, and that hunting knife with the bone handle that made us all feel dangerous and grown up. "We need proof we were actually inside," Marshall had said, pacing around the basement like a general planning a military operation. "Something we can bring back to show we didn't chicken out." Phoenix looked up from his hand-drawn map. "Like what?" "I don't know. A plate or something. Maybe one of those old photographs." Brody pushed his glasses up his nose. "Isn't that stealing?" "It's not stealing if nobody owns it anymore," Marshall shot back. "The house has been empty for 40 years. Everything inside is just junk." But I could tell from the way his voice cracked that he was more nervous than he let on. We all were. The beer had worn off, leaving us jittery and second-guessing ourselves, but nobody wanted to be the first to chicken out. Lloyd had grabbed a bottle of whiskey from behind his dad's paint cans, something brown and expensive looking that we definitely shouldn't have been touching. "Liquid courage," he'd said, unscrewing the cap and taking a small sip that made him cough and wince. "Your dad's going to kill you," I said. "Only if he finds out." Lloyd passed the bottle to Marshall, who took a bigger gulp and managed not to make a face, though his eyes watered. The whiskey burned my throat when my turn came, tasting like fire and regret. But it did make me feel braver, or at least more reckless, which probably amounted to the same thing when you're 12 years old and planning to break into a haunted house. Phoenix had spread his napkin map on the workbench, weighing down the corners with screwdrivers. We go out through the basement door, across the Hendersons' yard, then through the gap in the cemetery fence behind the maintenance shed. The old section is here, he pointed, and the oak tree marks the boundary with the Hartwell property. How do you know about the gap in the fence? Brody asked. I've been planning this for weeks, Phoenix said matter-of-factly. I scouted the whole route last Sunday after church. That should have been our first red flag. Phoenix had been planning this trip way before he even told us about it. But at 12, we figured being prepared just meant he was smart, not that he might be totally obsessed. Lloyd threw his backpack over his shoulder and glanced at his watch. 11:45. We better head out if we want to make it there by midnight. Why midnight? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Because that's when the veil between worlds is thinnest, Phoenix said in that serious way he had when he was quoting something he'd read. Midnight is when spirits are most active. Marshall laughed, but it came out strained. Ghosts aren't real, Phoenix. We're just gonna check out some old house. Then why are you so nervous? Phoenix shot back. I'm not nervous. Your hands are shaking. Marshall shoved his hands in his pockets. It's freezing down here. But it wasn't freezing. If anything, the basement felt hot and stuffy from the 5 of us crowded together, breathing hard and passing around stolen whiskey like we were pirates planning a raid. I remember glancing around at my 4 best friends and feeling this strange mix of love and terror. We'd been tight since 2nd grade, when Phoenix had moved to town, and Marshall had decided we needed to include the quiet new kid in our group. Lloyd had been the first to offer Phoenix half his sandwich at lunch. Brody had helped him with math homework. I'd shared my colored pencils during art class. Now here we were, 5 years later, about to do something that felt way more serious than any of our previous adventures. We'd built forts in the woods, explored the old quarry, even snuck into the high school football games without paying. But this was different. This felt like crossing a line we couldn't uncross. Last chance to back out, Marshall said, but he was looking directly at me when he said it. I wanted to say yes. Wanted to suggest we just watch scary movies and eat popcorn instead. But I also didn't want to be the scared little girl who ruined their big adventure. And there was something else, a strange curiosity that had been building all evening. What if Phoenix was right? What if there really was something supernatural in that house? I'm in, I heard myself say. Lloyd turned off the basement lights, and we climbed the stairs in darkness, our flashlights creating dancing circles on the walls. The house above us was quiet. His parents wouldn't be back until Sunday afternoon, giving us plenty of time for our midnight expedition. The back door opened with a soft click, and October air rushed in, carrying the smell of dead leaves and distant wood smoke. The night was clear and cold, with stars scattered across the sky like grains of salt on black velvet. Stay close, Phoenix whispered, though we were still in Lloyd's backyard and nowhere near anything dangerous. But as we crossed the grass toward the cemetery fence, I felt my stomach twist with something that wasn't excitement anymore. It was pure dread, like my body knew something my brain hadn't figured out yet. I should have listened to that feeling, should have grabbed my friends and dragged them back to the safety of Lloyd's basement. Instead, I followed them into the darkness, toward a house that had been waiting 40 years for 5 kids stupid enough to answer its call. The basement door opened without a sound, and we slipped out into Lloyd's backyard like we were escaping prison. The October air hit my face, sharp and cold, carrying the smell of dead leaves and something else I couldn't name, something that made my stomach twist. "This way," Phoenix whispered, shouldering his backpack full of research notes and maps. He'd planned this route down to the last detail, which should have made me feel better, but somehow made everything worse. We crossed the Hendersons' yard in single file, our sneakers quiet on the frost-covered grass. Marshall walked behind me, and I could hear him breathing hard even though we weren't moving fast. Every few steps he'd mutter something under his breath, jokes about ghosts or comments about how easy this was going to be, but his voice had that tight quality it got when he was trying too hard to sound brave. The cemetery fence stood ahead of us, 8 feet of wrought iron topped with decorative spikes that looked way more dangerous in the dark than they did during the day. Phoenix led us around to the back, past the maintenance shed where the groundskeepers kept their equipment. "Here," he said, pointing to a section where the fence had pulled away from its post, creating a gap just wide enough for a kid to squeeze through. Lloyd went first, his backpack snagging on the iron as he squeezed through. Then Brody, who had to remove his glasses and pass them to me before he could fit. Marshall motioned for me to go next, but I shook my head. "You go. I'll follow." The truth was, I didn't want to be the first one into the cemetery. Something about the darkness beyond that fence made my skin crawl. Marshall squeezed through the gap, and then it was my turn. The iron was cold against my back, and for a second I got stuck. My jacket caught on something sharp. Panic shot through me. What if I couldn't get through? What if I was trapped here while my friends went on without me? But then I was through, standing in the old section of Riverside Cemetery with my 4 best friends, our flashlights making small circles of light in all that darkness. "Stay close," Phoenix said, though he was already moving ahead, weaving between headstones that rose from the ground like broken teeth. The cemetery felt different at night. During the day, it was just a place where old people came to visit graves and leave flowers. But now, with darkness pooling between the monuments and our footsteps bouncing off marble and granite, it felt alive. Watching. "Check this out," Phoenix said, stopping beside a tall monument topped with a stone angel. The angel's face was turned upward, its mouth open like it was screaming silently at the sky. 1873. This whole section is from the 1800s. "Can we please keep moving?" Brody whispered, pushing his glasses up his nose. His flashlight beam shook as he swept it across the surrounding graves. But Phoenix was in his element, calling out names from headstones like he was giving a tour. The Blackwood family all died in 1891, probably typhoid. He walked to another grave. Sarah Mitchell, age 16, died in childbirth. "Phoenix," Marshall said, his voice sharper than usual. "We didn't come here for a history lesson." "Actually, this is all connected," Phoenix said, pulling out his notebook. "I've been mapping the deaths in this area, the cemetery, the Hartwell house, even some of the older homes on Elm Street. There's a pattern." Lloyd adjusted his backpack, gear clinking quietly inside. "What kind of pattern?" "Violent deaths, suicides, people dying young or in weird accidents. It's like there's something about this whole area that attracts tragedy." I wanted to tell him to stop talking, to put away his notebook and just get us to the house so we could look at it and leave. But I couldn't get the words out. The cemetery pressed in around us, full of shadows that moved wrong and sounds that might have been wind but probably weren't. We walked deeper into the old section, past fancy tombs and family plots surrounded by iron fencing. Some of the graves were so old the names had worn away completely, leaving blank stones that stared back at us like empty sockets in the darkness. "There," Phoenix said, pointing ahead to where a massive oak tree stood at the cemetery's far edge. "That's the boundary." Beyond the tree, I could see another fence, this one lower and more rusted than the cemetery's barrier. And beyond that fence, rising from an overgrown yard like something out of a nightmare, stood the Hartwell house. 3 stories of Victorian architecture gone wrong. The wraparound porch sagged in the middle, its decorative railings broken and hanging at weird angles. Windows stared down at us, their glass either missing entirely or cracked into spider webs that caught our flashlight beams. The roof had holes where shingles had fallen away, and the whole place seemed to lean slightly to one side, like it might topple over if the wind got stronger. But it wasn't the decay that made my stomach drop. It was something else, something I couldn't put into words. The house felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with how it looked. It felt hungry. "Holy shit," Marshall breathed, and nobody told him to watch his language. "It's bigger than I thought it would be," Lloyd said, his voice small. Brody had stopped walking entirely, his flashlight beam fixed on the house's dark windows. "Maybe we should just look at it from here. We can see everything we need to see." But Phoenix was already moving toward the fence, his excitement overriding whatever caution he might have felt. "We're not backing out now. We've come this far." The fence around the Hartwell property was only about 4 feet high, wrought iron like the cemeteries, but older and more rusted. Phoenix grabbed the top rail and jumped over in one smooth motion, landing in the tall grass on the other side. "Come on," he called back to us. "It's easy." Marshall went next, pulling himself over with more effort than Phoenix had needed. Then Lloyd, his backpack making the climb awkward. Brody hesitated, glancing back at me like he was hoping I'd suggest we turn around. "We don't have to do this," I said quietly, just to him. "I know," he said, "but I can't be the one who chickens out." He handed me his flashlight and climbed over the fence, moving slowly and carefully. Then it was just me, standing alone in the cemetery while my friends waited on the other side. The house towered above them, its broken windows like empty eye sockets. I could feel it watching me, waiting to see what I would do. Part of me wanted to run back to Lloyd's house, to safety and warmth and normal 12-year-old problems. But a bigger part of me couldn't bear the thought of leaving my friends behind. I grabbed the fence rail and pulled myself up. The iron was so cold it stung my palms, and for a second I balanced there, one leg on each side, looking down at the Hartwell property. The grass was knee-high and dead, full of weeds and junk that had blown in over the years. A stone path led from the fence to the house's front porch, but it was cracked and overgrown, barely visible in the darkness. And everywhere, scattered across the yard like broken promises, were pieces of what had once been a garden, rusted trellises, the skeleton of a gazebo, flower beds that had turned into patches of thorny wilderness. I swung my other leg over and dropped down into the grass. The moment my feet touched the Hartwell property, something changed. The air got thicker, harder to breathe. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. And underneath it all, so quiet I almost missed it, was a sound like whispering. "You okay?" Marshall asked, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, because I wasn't okay. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to climb back over that fence and run. But my friends were already walking toward the house, their flashlight beams dancing across the broken porch steps and sagging roof. I followed them through the dead grass, each step feeling like I was walking deeper into something I'd never be able to escape. The house got bigger as we got closer, its dark windows throwing our lights back at us like mirrors. Up close, I could see details that made everything worse. Scratches in the wood siding that looked almost like claw marks, shutters hanging by single hinges, and a front door that stood slightly open, showing nothing but blackness beyond. "The side door," Phoenix said, consulting his notebook. "That's how we get in. The front porch is too dangerous." He led us around the side of the house, past windows so dirty we couldn't see through them, and a cellar door that had been chained shut. The side door hung crooked on its hinges, the wood around the frame rotted and splintered. And it was open. Not wide, just a few inches, but enough to show us the darkness waiting inside. "Ladies first," Marshall said, but his attempt at humor fell flat. His voice cracked on the words, and I could see his hands shaking in the flashlight beam. Phoenix stepped forward and pushed the door wider. It opened with a long, drawn-out creak that seemed to carry through the entire house. And with it came a smell that made all of us step back. Decades of dust and mold and something else. Something sweet and rotten that reminded me of the dead possum we'd found behind the school last spring. "Jesus," Lloyd whispered, covering his nose with his sleeve. Brody aimed his flashlight through the doorway, showing a narrow hallway lined with peeling wallpaper. The beam looked weak and useless against the darkness, as if the house was eating up the light. "We don't have to go in," I said, one last desperate attempt to save us all. "We've seen it. We can tell everyone we went inside." But Marshall was already stepping through the doorway, his flashlight beam vanishing into the hallway. "Come on," he called back to us. "It's just an old house." Phoenix followed him, then Lloyd, then Brody. And finally, because I couldn't bear to be left alone in that dead yard with the house's empty windows staring down at me, I stepped through the entrance and into the darkness. The moment I crossed into the house, I felt it, a tugging sensation, not physical but mental, like something was calling to me from deep inside, from somewhere high above us, from upstairs. The house towered over us like something that had crawled out of a nightmare and decided to stay. 3 stories of Victorian architecture gone completely wrong. The wraparound porch drooped so badly in the middle I thought it might collapse if we breathed on it too hard. Windows stared down at us, most of them missing glass entirely or cracked into spider webs that caught our flashlight beams and bounced them back like broken mirrors. "Jesus," Lloyd whispered, adjusting his backpack straps. "It's huge." It was massive, but that wasn't what made my stomach drop. The house felt wrong in a way I couldn't put into words. Not just abandoned or creepy, wrong, like it was watching us approach and liking what it saw. "The front porch is completely rotted," Phoenix said, consulting his notebook even though we could all see the broken railings hanging at weird angles. "We'll go around to the side." Marshall tried to laugh, but it came out shaky. "Good thing we're not here to sell Girl Scout cookies." Nobody else laughed. We were all looking up at those dark windows, and I swear I could feel something looking back. Phoenix led us through the tall grass around the side of the house. Up close, the details were even worse. Scratches in the wood siding that looked almost like claw marks, shutters hanging by single hinges, and paint peeling off in long strips that curled like dead skin. 40 years, Lloyd said quietly. The family just walked away and left everything inside. "Wouldn't you?" Brody pushed his glasses up his nose, his voice barely audible. The side door hung crooked on its hinges, the wood around the frame so rotted I could see daylight through the gaps. But what made my skin crawl was that it stood partially open, not wide, just a few inches, like the house was holding its breath. "Perfect," Phoenix said, like finding an unlocked door to a haunted house was exactly what he'd been hoping for. Marshall stepped forward, trying to reclaim his role as group leader. "Ladies first," he said, but his voice cracked on the words, and his hands trembled in the light. "Very funny," I said, but I didn't move toward that door. Something about the slice of darkness visible through the opening made every instinct I had scream warnings. Phoenix grabbed the door handle and pushed it wider. The hinges let out this long, drawn-out creak that seemed to bounce through the entire house, rolling off walls and ceilings we couldn't see. And with that sound came a smell that slammed into us. "Oh, God," Brody gagged, covering his nose with his sleeve. It was decades of dust and mold, sure, but underneath that was something else, something sweet and putrid that reminded me of the dead possum we'd found behind the school last spring, except worse, more intense, like whatever had died in there had been decomposing for years. "That's just old house smell," Marshall said, but he'd stepped back too, his face pale in the flashlight glow. Brody grabbed his flashlight and aimed it through the doorway. The beam showed a narrow hallway lined with wallpaper peeling off in long strips, water stains spreading across the ceiling like dark bruises. But the light felt weak and useless against the shadows, as if the house was eating it up. "We don't have to go in," I said, one last desperate attempt to save us all. "We've seen it. We can tell everyone we went inside." But even as I said it, I knew we were past the point of no return. We'd come too far, planned too much, worked ourselves into such a frenzy that backing down felt impossible. And there was something else, this strange pull that had been building all evening, getting stronger with each step toward the house. What if Phoenix was right? What if there really was something otherworldly in there? Lloyd reached over and grabbed my hand, his fingers cold and slick with sweat. I couldn't tell if he was trying to comfort me or himself. "It's just an old house," Marshall said, but he had to clear his throat twice before the words came out right. Then he stepped across the threshold, his flashlight beam disappearing into the hallway like it had been swallowed whole. Phoenix followed him immediately, then Lloyd, his backpack rattling with all those supplies that suddenly seemed completely useless. Brody hesitated, looking back at me with his eyes wide behind his glasses. "We don't have to do this," I whispered to him. "I know," he said, "but I can't be the one who chickens out." He stepped through the doorway, and then it was just me standing alone in that dead yard with the house's broken windows staring down at me like empty eye sockets. I could hear my friends moving around inside, their voices carrying strangely through the rooms. Marshall was trying to crack jokes about the smell. Phoenix was already wandering around, his footsteps creaking on old floorboards. Lloyd was asking if everyone still had working flashlights. The smart thing would have been to climb back over that fence and run home. Call my parents. Tell them where my friends were. Let the adults handle whatever was happening. But I couldn't bear the thought of leaving them behind, and I couldn't stand the idea of being the scared little girl who wrecked their big adventure. I took a deep breath through my mouth, trying to avoid that awful smell, and stepped through the doorway. The moment my foot touched the floor inside the Hartwell house, everything changed. The air got thicker, harder to breathe, like the atmosphere had turned to molasses. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. And underneath it all, so faint I almost missed it, was a sound like whispering. But worse than any of that was the tugging sensation. Not physical, but mental, like something deep inside the house was calling to me. Something that knew I was there and wanted me to come closer. Something that had been waiting for us in the attic. The moment Phoenix said attic, something changed in the house around us. The air got thicker, pressing down like we were suddenly underwater, and I swear, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. My breath came out in visible puffs now, which should have been crazy since it wasn't that cold outside. "There," Phoenix said, pointing his flashlight beam toward the ceiling above the main staircase. "You can see where the attic stairs start." I followed his light and spotted what he was pointing at. A narrow opening in the ceiling, mostly hidden in the darkness, with the bottom steps of a steep staircase just barely visible. "Cool," Marshall said. but his voice sounded forced. "We should check out the second floor first, though, right? Work our way up?" Lloyd adjusted his backpack straps, the supplies inside rattling softly. "Makes sense. See what's in all these rooms." But I couldn't stop staring at that dark opening above us. Something about it made my stomach twist, like looking over the edge of a cliff. And underneath the musty smell of the house, I caught something else, something sweet and rotten that seemed to be drifting down from above. "The newspapers in the kitchen are from October 1952, Lloyd said, trying to fill the silence. "Right before Mrs. Hartwell died. There's still food in the pantry, all moldy and gross." Brody pushed his glasses up his nose. "They really did just leave everything." "Not left," Phoenix corrected, consulting his notebook even though he probably had every detail memorized by now. "Mrs. Hartwell killed herself in the attic. The family couldn't bear to come back for their things." "Can we please stop talking about people dying in here?" I said, but my voice came out smaller than I intended. Marshall laughed, but it sounded hollow in the thick air. "Come on, it's just history. Really old history." We started up the main staircase, our footsteps making a chorus of creaks and groans that bounced off the walls. Family portraits lined the stairway. Old photographs in heavy frames showing stern-faced people in Victorian clothing. Their eyes seemed to follow us as we climbed, and I found myself looking away from them, focusing instead on the worn carpet runner beneath our feet. The second-floor hallway stretched longer than it should have, given the house's exterior dimensions. Doors stood open on both sides, revealing glimpses of bedrooms frozen in time. Marshall pushed into the first room on the right, his flashlight showing a master bedroom with a massive four-poster bed draped in moth-eaten curtains. "Jesus," he called out. "There's still clothes in the closet, dresses and everything." Phoenix had found a child's nursery, complete with a wooden crib and toys scattered across the floor. 3 children, he said, checking his notes. Ages 4, 6, and 8 when Mrs. Hartwell hanged herself. "Stop," Brody whispered, but Phoenix either didn't hear him or chose to ignore him. Lloyd discovered a bathroom with an old clawfoot tub, the porcelain stained dark with decades of neglect. "The water's still connected," he said, turning a faucet that produced nothing but a dry, rattling sound. I stayed in the hallway, sweeping my flashlight across the walls. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips, and underneath I could see older layers, different patterns from different decades, like the house was shedding its skin over and over again. That's when Brody found it. "Hey," he called softly from the far end of the hall. "There's another door here." We gathered around him, our flashlights lighting up what looked like a closet door, narrow and painted the same color as the wall. But when Brody turned the handle and pulled it open, we saw steep wooden stairs disappearing upward into complete darkness. The attic stairs. The moment that door opened, the pulling sensation hit me hard. Not something I could see or hear, but something I felt in my chest, in my bones, like invisible hands reaching down from above and tugging at something deep inside me. It was so strong I actually took a step forward before I caught myself. "Whoa," Lloyd said, steadying me with his free hand. "You okay?" I wanted to say no, wanted to tell them about the strange tugging sensation, wanted to suggest we get out of here and never return. But the words wouldn't come. Because part of me, a part I didn't understand and didn't want to acknowledge, was drawn to those stairs, curious about what lurked in the blackness above. "This is it," Phoenix said, his voice filled with excitement. "This is where Mrs. Hartwell died, where she hanged herself." Marshall moved closer to the stairway, his flashlight beam hitting only a few steps before the darkness ate it up. "It's just an attic," he said, but his voice wavered. The tugging feeling grew stronger, and with it came something else, a sound so quiet I almost missed it. Like whispering, but not quite. Like something shifting around up there, waiting for us to climb those creaky steps. "We should go up," Phoenix said, and I realized with horror that he was already putting his foot on the first step. The second-floor hallway stretched out in front of us way longer than it should have been based on what the house looked like from outside. Doors hung open on both sides, showing glimpses of rooms that had been frozen in time for 40 years. "This place is massive," Lloyd whispered, adjusting his backpack straps. The supplies inside rattled softly with each step. Marshall pushed into the first bedroom on the right, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Holy shit," he called out, then caught himself and lowered his voice. "There's still everything in here. Clothes in the closet, shoes on the floor." I stayed in the hallway, playing my light across the peeling wallpaper. Underneath the top layer, I could see older patterns, different designs from different decades, like the house had been changing its look over and over again. Phoenix had found what looked like a child's nursery. "3 kids lived here," he said, reading from his notebook, even though he probably had every detail memorized. "Ages 4, 6, and 8 when Mrs. Hartwell died." "Can we please stop talking about dead people?" I said, but my voice came out smaller than I wanted. The air up here felt different than downstairs, thicker somehow, like trying to breathe through wet cotton, and colder, way colder. I could see my breath now, which made no sense since it wasn't that cold outside. Lloyd found a bathroom with an old clawfoot tub, the porcelain stained dark with decades of neglect. When he turned the faucet, it made this awful rattling sound, but no water came out. "The family just walked away," Marshall said from the master bedroom. "Left everything behind." "Wouldn't you?" Brody pushed his glasses up his nose, his voice barely audible. That's when we heard it. A sound from somewhere above us. Not loud, just a soft creaking, like someone walking around upstairs. We all froze, flashlights pointed at the ceiling. "Just the house settling," Marshall said, but his voice cracked on the words. Phoenix was already heading toward the far end of the hallway, his flashlight beam sweeping across the walls. There should be attic access somewhere up here. I wanted to suggest we'd seen enough, that we should head back downstairs and get out of there. But something kept me quiet. Something that was growing stronger the longer we stayed in the house. A strange curiosity mixed with fear, like when you know you shouldn't look at something but can't help yourself. "Found it," Brody called softly from the very end of the hall. We gathered around him, our flashlights lighting up what I'd first thought was just another closet door. It was narrow and painted the same faded color as the wall, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But when Brody turned the handle and pulled it open, we saw steep wooden stairs disappearing upward into complete darkness. The moment that door opened, everything changed. The pulling sensation hit me hard, not something I could see or hear, but something I felt deep in my chest, in my bones, like invisible hands reaching down from above and tugging at something inside me. It was so strong I actually took a step forward before I caught myself. "Whoa," Lloyd said, grabbing my arm. "You okay?" I couldn't answer. The pulling was getting stronger, and with it came the most intense fear I'd ever experienced. Not just scared, terrified in a way that made my stomach twist and my hands shake. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get away from those stairs, to drag my friends out of this house right now. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. "This is it," Phoenix said, his voice filled with excitement that made my skin crawl. "This is where she did it. where Mrs. Hartwell hanged herself. Marshall stepped closer to the stairway, his flashlight beam reaching only a few steps up before being swallowed by the darkness. "It's just an attic," he said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. The tugging feeling got stronger, so intense it made me dizzy. And underneath it, so quiet I almost missed it, was a sound. Like whispering, but not quite. Like something moving around up there in the blackness. Something waiting. "We shouldn't go up there," I whispered, my fingers digging into Lloyd's jacket. The words came out strangled, desperate. "Please, we shouldn't." But even as I said it, I felt myself being pulled toward those dark stairs. Part of me, a part I couldn't understand and didn't want to acknowledge, wanted to climb up there, wanted to see what was calling to us from above. Phoenix was already putting his foot on the first step. The pulling sensation wrapped around me like invisible chains, dragging me toward those dark stairs step by step. I tried to fight it, digging my heels into the warped floorboards, but my body wasn't listening to my brain anymore. "Don't," I whispered, but the word came out strangled. "Please don't go up there." Marshall was already 3 steps up, his flashlight beam swaying as he climbed. "It's fine," he called back, but his voice sounded weird, flat and distant, like he was talking in his sleep. Phoenix followed right behind him, then Lloyd with his rattling backpack. The wooden stairs made awful sounds under their weight, each creak bouncing through the house like a warning. That's when the terror hit me. Not just scared. This was something else entirely. Pure animal panic that started in my stomach and spread through my whole body like poison. My hand started shaking so hard I dropped my flashlight. It hit the floor and rolled, the beam spinning wildly before going out completely. The pulling got stronger, so strong it felt like something had hooked into my ribs and was dragging me forward. But underneath that unnatural tugging was something worse. The absolute certainty that whatever waited in the attic meant to hurt us, to kill us. I doubled over and threw up against the hallway wall. The beer and whiskey came back up, burning my throat, but I barely noticed because the wrongness was getting worse by the second. "Something's wrong," I gasped, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. "Guys, something's really wrong." But they weren't listening. Marshall had reached the top of the stairs, his flashlight vanishing into the attic. Phoenix was right behind him, and Lloyd was halfway up, his backpack scraping against the narrow walls. Only Brody had stopped. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at me with this strange expression on his face. His eyes looked glassy behind his glasses, like he was seeing something I couldn't. "Come on," he said, and his voice sounded just as flat and distant as Marshall's had. "We have to see." "No." I backed away from the stairs, my legs shaking. "Brody, don't, please." But he was already climbing, his footsteps joining the others on the wooden steps. The sound grew fainter until I couldn't hear them anymore. The house went completely silent. Not just quiet, silent in a way that made my ears ring. No creaking floorboards, no whispered conversations, no sounds of movement from above. Nothing. The quiet surrounded me, heavy and thick, making it hard to breathe. "Guys!" I called out, my voice cracking. Nothing. The tugging feeling was still there, more intense than before, trying to pull me up those steps. But now I could sense something else underneath it. A desperate craving. Whatever waited up there was starving, and it needed me to come closer. "Marshall?" I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. That's when I heard it. A sound from the attic that made every hair on my body stand up. Wet and sliding, like something being dragged across the floor. Then something that might have been laughter, but wrong somehow. Too low, too long. The fear finally broke whatever hold the house had on me. I ran, down the hallway, tripping over my own feet in the darkness. Down the main staircase, my hands gripping the banister as I took the steps 3 at a time, through the front rooms where our footprints were still visible in the dust. I slammed into the side door at full speed, bursting through it like it was made of paper. The cold October air slapped my face, and I gulped it down desperately, my lungs on fire. But I didn't stop running. Across the overgrown yard, through the dead grass and weeds, over the cemetery fence, scraping my hands on the rusted iron but not caring about the pain. Between the headstones, past the stone angel with its screaming face, my flashlight long gone, and only the moonlight to guide me. 6 blocks had never felt so long. Every shadow looked like something following me. Every sound made me run faster. By the time I reached Lloyd's backyard, I was screaming for help before I even got to the door. I hammered on the basement door with both fists, sobbing and screaming until a light flicked on upstairs. Mrs. Peterson showed up at the back door in her bathrobe, her face puzzled and scared. "Melody, what are you doing here? Where are the boys?" I tried to explain, tried to tell her about the house and the pulling and the sounds from the attic, but the words came out jumbled and desperate. All I could manage was, "something in the house," over and over again, while she called my parents. My father arrived within minutes, his face serious as he listened to my broken explanation. He called the police while my mother wrapped me in blankets, but when they asked me to come back with them to show them where my friends were, I couldn't do it. The fear was still too strong, the memory of that wet sliding sound too fresh. I stayed home and waited, knowing deep down that when they found my friends, it would be too late. I ran. Not walked fast or hurried, ran like something was chasing me, which maybe it was. The side door slammed against the house as I burst through it, and I stumbled across the overgrown yard, my feet catching in the dead grass and weeds. The cemetery fence rose ahead of me, 8 feet of wrought iron spikes that had seemed manageable an hour ago. Now it looked like too much, but I didn't slow down. I hit it at full speed and started climbing, my hands slipping on the cold metal. I fell backward the first time, landing hard on my tailbone. Got up and tried again. This time I made it halfway before my jacket caught on one of the decorative spikes, and I hung there for a second, suspended and panicking, before the fabric ripped and I tumbled over the top. The iron scraped along my palms and knees as I hit the ground on the other side. Blood, probably, but I couldn't feel anything except the need to get away from that house. Away from whatever was in the attic with my friends. The old section of Riverside Cemetery stretched out in front of me, all crooked headstones and twisted trees creating strange patterns of light and dark in the moonlight. I ran between the graves, past the stone angel with its mouth open like it was screaming, past the Blackwood family plot where Phoenix had stopped to read inscriptions just an hour ago. Had it really been only an hour? My lungs burned as I gasped for air, but I couldn't slow down. Every shadow looked like something following me. Every sound, wind through the trees, my own footsteps on the gravel path, made me run faster. 6 blocks had never felt so long. I hit the sidewalk on Maple Street and kept running, past the Hendersons' house where we'd started this whole mess, past the streetlights that made everything look orange and fake. My legs felt like rubber, but pure panic kept pushing me forward. By the time I reached Lloyd's backyard, I was yelling for help before I even got to the door. Help! I pounded on the basement entrance with both fists, the metal door rattling under my hands. "Mrs. Peterson, help!" A light came on upstairs, then another one. I kept pounding and yelling until the back door opened and Mrs. Peterson appeared in her bathrobe, her hair in curlers and her face confused. "Melody? What in the world?" She looked around the empty yard. "Where are the boys?" I tried to answer, but all that came out was a choked sob. She was supposed to be at her sister's cabin until Sunday. She shouldn't be here. "The house," I managed to gasp out between gulps of air. "Something in the house." Mrs. Peterson's face went pale. She stepped outside, glancing around like she expected to see Marshall and Lloyd and the others hiding behind the garage. "What house?" "Melody, where are they?" "The Hartwell house." The words felt like broken glass in my throat. "We went to the Hartwell house and something—" I doubled over, my stomach cramping. "They're still there. They won't come down." Mrs. Peterson grabbed my shoulders, her fingers digging in through my jacket. "You went where?" "Melody, what are you talking about?" But I couldn't explain. Couldn't make her understand about the pulling sensation, or the sounds from the attic, or the way the air had gotten thick and wrong. All I could do was cry and shake while she walked me inside and called my parents. My father's car turned into the driveway 7 minutes later. I know because I watched the kitchen clock the whole time, the second hand moving so slowly it felt broken. Mrs. Peterson had wrapped me in one of Lloyd's blankets and made me sit at the kitchen table. But I couldn't stop trembling. Dad came through the back door still wearing his pajamas under his coat, his hair sticking up on one side. Mom was right behind him in her robe and slippers, her face pale with worry. "Where are they?" Dad asked, kneeling down next to my chair. His voice was calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "Melody, where are your friends?" "The attic," I whispered. "They went up to the attic and they won't come down." "What attic? What house?" "The Hartwell house on Elm Street." Mrs. Peterson answered for me, her voice shaky. "She says they went to the old Hartwell place." Dad's face went gray. He knew that house, knew the stories. Everyone in town did. He stood up and walked to Mrs. Peterson's phone, dialing 911 with steady fingers. "This is Robert Parker," he said when someone answered. "I need police and paramedics at the old Hartwell house on Elm Street. 4 children are gone inside." Gone. Not trapped, not hurt. Gone. Mom sat down next to me and pulled me against her side, her hand stroking my hair. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "Daddy's going to find them." But I knew he wouldn't. Not alive anyway. Because whatever had been calling to us from that attic wasn't something that let people go. The dispatcher must have asked Dad something because he looked at me and said, "Melody, can you come with us? Show the police exactly where—" "No." The word came out louder than I meant it to, sharp and desperate. "I can't go back there. Honey, we need to know." "No." I pulled away from Mom and back toward the kitchen door. "I can't. Please don't make me." The terror was still too raw, too recent. Just thinking about those narrow stairs made my stomach churn. I could still sense that tugging feeling, like unseen hands stretching across the space between here and there, trying to pull me back. Dad stared at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, you stay here with Mom." But I could see it in his expression, the same look Mrs. Peterson had when I tried to explain what happened. They thought I was in shock, that I was mixed up or imagining things. They didn't get it. Some things were worse than being lost. Some things were worse than getting hurt. And whatever was waiting in the Hartwell house attic was the worst thing of all. The kitchen clock ticked so loudly it sounded like a hammer hitting wood. Each second dragged on while I sat at our kitchen table, wrapped in the quilt Mom had pulled from the linen closet. She'd made me hot chocolate, but it sat there untouched, a skin forming on top as it cooled. "Drink something, sweetheart," Mom said, her voice tight with worry. She kept moving around the kitchen, wiping counters that were already clean, rearranging the salt and pepper shakers, checking the clock every 30 seconds like that would make Dad come home faster. I couldn't drink anything. My stomach felt like it was full of broken glass, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw those narrow wooden stairs disappearing into darkness. Felt that awful tugging sensation trying to drag me upward. "They're okay," Mom said, more to herself than to me. "They have to be okay." But I knew they weren't. Had known it the moment I heard that wet, sliding sound from the attic, the sound that might have been laughter but was all wrong. The thing that had been calling to us hadn't wanted to play games or scare us. It had wanted something else entirely. Mom picked up the phone and called a number she knew by heart. "Pastor Williams, it's Susan Parker. I'm sorry to call so late, but we have an emergency." 20 minutes later, Pastor Williams sat across from me at our kitchen table, his gray hair messed up from sleep and his coat buttoned wrong. He'd driven over in his pajamas and slippers, but his voice stayed steady and calm. "Let's pray together," he said, reaching for my hands. I let him hold them, but I couldn't focus on his words about protection and deliverance. All I could think about was Marshall's voice calling back from the attic stairs, flat and distant like he was talking in his sleep. The way Brody's eyes had looked glassy behind his glasses when he told me we had to see. They hadn't sounded like themselves anymore. Pastor Williams squeezed my hands. "The Lord is my shepherd," he said, and Mom joined in. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." But even those known words couldn't push away what I'd felt coming from the attic. Something had been waiting up there for a very long time. Something that fed on more than just fear. The kitchen clock showed 1:47 when we heard Dad's car in the driveway. I knew right away that something terrible had happened. Not from the sound of the engine or the way the car door slammed, but from his footsteps on the front porch. Dad always walked with purpose, his steps confident and quick. These footsteps were slow, heavy, like each one took enormous effort. Mom jumped up from the table. "Robert?" The front door opened and closed. Dad's keys hit the little dish by the entrance with a sharp clink that sounded way too loud in the quiet house. Then nothing. For a long moment. Like he was standing in the hallway trying to figure out what to do next. When he finally appeared in the kitchen doorway, I'd never seen him look so old. His face was gray, his hair messed up, and his hands shook as he pulled off his coat. There were dark stains on his shirt that I didn't want to think about. "Robert?" Mom's voice came out as a whisper. Dad looked at her, then at Pastor Williams, then at me. His eyes were bloodshot and empty, as if he'd witnessed something that had hollowed him out completely. "They're gone," he said quietly, thinking I couldn't hear from across the kitchen. But I heard it all. "All of them?" Mom's hand flew to her mouth. Dad nodded, dropping into the chair next to Pastor Williams. "The police found them in the attic. They're all..." He stopped, looking at me again. "I can take Melody to the living room," Pastor Williams offered. "No." The word came out sharper than I meant it to. "I want to know." Dad studied my face for a long moment, and I saw something change in his expression. The doubt that had been there earlier, when I'd tried to explain about the wrongness in the house, about the pulling sensation, was gone. Now he looked at me like he finally understood that I'd been telling the truth. "It looks like they were attacked by some kind of animal," he said carefully. "The police think maybe a bear that had been living in the house." Mom made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "I had to..." Dad's voice cracked. "I had to identify Lloyd and Marshall. By their clothes, because their faces. He stopped, pressing his palms against his eyes. The sick feeling in my gut twisted tighter. Where were they exactly? Melody, you don't need to. Where? Dad lowered his hands and looked at me directly. In the center of the attic, arranged in a circle. A circle. Not scattered around like they'd been running from something. Not huddled together in a corner trying to hide. Set up deliberately, like someone had placed them that way on purpose. Detective Crawford said it was the strangest thing he'd ever seen, Dad continued, his voice barely above a whisper. The way they were lying there, it almost looked... He trailed off. Looked like what? Like they'd been waiting for something. The pulling sensation. They'd felt it too, that invisible force calling them deeper into the attic. But unlike me, they hadn't been able to fight it. Or maybe they hadn't wanted to. Pastor Williams cleared his throat. Sometimes when people are frightened, This wasn't fear, Dad interrupted, and his voice was flat and certain. I've seen scared people, Reverend. This was something else entirely. Mom dropped into her chair, the color drained from her face. What kind of animal could do something like that? The kind that doesn't exist, I said quietly. Everyone turned to stare at me. Dad's gaze was the sharpest, as if he was finally really seeing me for the first time all evening. You felt it too, didn't you? I asked him. When you went in the house, you felt something wrong. Dad went quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. The air felt heavy, cold, and there was this smell. He shuddered. Detective Crawford kept talking about bear musk, but it wasn't that. It was something else, something sweet and rotten. Like death, I whispered. Like something that feeds on death, Dad corrected, and the words hung in the kitchen air like a curse. Pastor Williams moved uneasily in his seat. Now, let's not let our imaginations... My imagination didn't kill 4 children, Dad said sharply. Then, more quietly, but something did. The newspaper ran the story on the front page 3 days later. 4 local boys killed in bear attack. I read it sitting at our kitchen table while Mom made breakfast. She thought I might actually eat, the words blurring together as my eyes filled with tears I'd been holding back since that night. Tragic accident, the article called it. Rare predator attack. Detective Harrison Crawford was quoted extensively, explaining how a large black bear had somehow gotten into the abandoned Hartwell house and made its den in the attic. The boys had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. I wanted to scream. Dad sat across from me, his coffee getting cold while he stared out the kitchen window. He hadn't said much since that night, but I caught him watching me sometimes with this look I couldn't figure out, like he was trying to piece together what I knew that he didn't. The medical examiner confirmed it, Mom said, setting a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me that I wouldn't touch. Dr. Spencer found evidence of animal claws and teeth. It's terrible, but at least now we know what happened. But we didn't know. Not really. The details came in pieces over the next few days, whispered conversations between adults who thought I wasn't listening. Detective Crawford had found the boys in the center of the attic, positioned in a perfect circle like someone had placed them that way on purpose. Not scattered around like they'd been running, not huddled together trying to hide. Placed there. Mrs. Henderson told my mother about it while I sat on our front porch, pretending to read but actually listening in on their conversation by the mailbox. Crawford said it was the strangest thing, Mrs. Henderson whispered. Like they'd been waiting for something, just lying there in a circle, staring up at the ceiling. Animals don't do that, Mom replied, her voice uncertain. That's what I said. But what else could it have been? What else indeed? Dr. Spencer came to our house on Thursday evening, his usually perfect appearance messed up and his hands shaking as he took the coffee Mom offered. I was supposed to be upstairs doing homework, but I snuck to the top of the stairs and listened through the banister. "I've been a medical examiner for 15 years, he told my parents, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen bear attacks, mountain lion maulings, every kind of animal predation you can imagine. This wasn't that." "But your report said," Dad started. "My report said what Crawford needed it to say." Dr. Spencer's cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down. "But between us, Robert, those boys died with their eyes wide open. All of them. Expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces." "Fear of the bear," Mom suggested weakly. "No." Dr. Spencer was quiet for a long moment. This was something else. Something that scared them so badly it literally stopped their hearts before the physical trauma even occurred. I pressed my face against the banister, pulse racing. "There's something else," Dr. Spencer continued. "Crawford found markings on the attic walls, deep scratches carved into the wood. But they weren't random claw marks. They formed symbols, deliberate patterns." "What kind of symbols?" Dad asked. "The kind that suggests this wasn't an animal attack at all." The conversation went quiet after that, but I heard Dr. Spencer leave through the back door instead of the front, like he didn't want to be seen. Detective Crawford himself stopped by Friday afternoon, his gray eyes weary and his usually neat appearance wrinkled. He sat in our living room and asked me the same questions he'd asked 3 times already, but softer now, like he was handling something that might break. "You're sure you didn't see any animal tracks around the house, Melody? Any signs of a large predator?" "No, sir." "And when you ran, you didn't hear any sounds that might have been a bear? Growling, roaring?" I thought about the wet sliding sound, the laughter that wasn't quite laughter. "No, sir." Crawford studied my face for a long moment. "What did you hear?" The question caught me off guard. Not what I thought I heard or what I might have imagined. What I heard. "Something moving around upstairs," I said carefully. "Something that didn't sound right." "Didn't sound right how?" I looked at my parents, then back at Crawford, like it was there for us. Crawford's face stayed the same, but something changed behind his eyes. "There how?" "Like it knew we were coming." He scribbled something in his notebook, then snapped it shut. "The house gets torn down next week," he said, getting to his feet. "City council voted it through. Too risky to keep it around." But when the demolition crew showed up that Monday, they found nothing but a pile of smoking ash where the Hartwell house used to be. Someone had torched it overnight, soaked it in gasoline, and set it ablaze. The fire department said it burned so fierce and quick that only the foundation remained. Nobody bothered investigating the fire. No one seemed too broken up about it either. If anything, the grown-ups around town looked like a weight had been lifted off their shoulders. I went to Marshall's funeral on Tuesday, Lloyd's on Wednesday, Phoenix's on Thursday. Brody's family held a private service on Friday that I wasn't invited to, which was probably for the best because I'd already cried myself dry. Every service felt identical. Crowded churches filled with sobbing families. Ministers speaking about God's plan and terrible accidents. Coffins that stayed shut because of what Dr. Spencer had discovered. Everyone bought the bear attack story because it made sense when nothing else did. Wild animals were dangerous but predictable. They could be hunted, trapped, moved somewhere else. They had patterns you could understand. Whatever had killed my friends didn't have any patterns at all. I never told anyone about that tugging feeling or how the air had turned heavy and strange. Never brought up the noises from upstairs or how certain I'd been that something was starving up there. Who'd listen to a 12-year-old girl who ran and left her friends behind? So I sat through the funerals and heard the grown-ups tell each other comforting lies about wild animals and freak accidents, knowing the real story died with my friends in that house across the graveyard, the one that had been calling to us. The real story that some things are much worse than dying, and some things were still out there, waiting. I folded the newspaper and set it on the coffee table, but Marshall's face kept staring up at me from the obituary photo. 34 years old, dead from complications related to substance abuse, which was the polite way of saying he'd drunk himself to death, trying to forget what happened in that attic. The coffee in my mug had gone cold hours ago, but I drank it anyway. Bitter and lukewarm, like everything else in my life had become. I'd been sitting here since dawn, reading and rereading those few paragraphs about Marshall Lynch's death, and each time the words left me feeling gutted. Survived by his mother, Patricia Lynch, and sister, Rebecca Lynch Morrison. No wife, no children. Just like me. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the October morning. 30 years to the day since we'd climbed through that gap in the cemetery fence. 5 12-year-olds who thought we were brave enough to face down a ghost story. Only one of us had been smart enough, or cowardly enough, to run. The guilt never left. Not really. People told me I'd been lucky, that I'd escaped a terrible tragedy. But they didn't understand. Luck implied randomness, chance, being in the right place at the right time. What happened to me wasn't luck. I'd been chosen to survive. My apartment was quiet except for the buzz of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Maple Street. I'd lived here for 8 years now, ever since the divorce from David became final. He'd tried to understand my nightmares, my inability to sleep in complete darkness, the way I'd wake up screaming about something pulling me upward. But how do you explain to someone that you're haunted not just by what you saw, but by what you didn't see? How do you tell them that sometimes, even now, you feel invisible hands reaching across 3 decades, trying to drag you back to finish what was started? The filing cabinet in my bedroom held everything I'd gathered over the years. Newspaper clippings, historical society records, property deeds, death certificates. I'd become an expert on the Hartwell house and its history, driven by a need to understand what had killed my friends. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell hadn't just killed herself in 1952. The real story, buried in police records I'd finally gotten through a Freedom of Information request, was much worse. She'd hanged herself in the attic after murdering her 3 young children, Emma, age 4, Thomas, age 6, and Sarah, age 8. The official report said it was a murder-suicide caused by grief over her husband's death in Korea, but Eleanor's final letter told something completely different. Something in the house commands it. She'd written in shaky handwriting. It whispers to me from the attic, tells me what I must do. The children hear it too. They've been sleepwalking upstairs, standing at the bottom of the attic stairs and staring up into the darkness. It wants them. It wants all of us. I have to stop it the only way I can. The police had buried the letter, calling it the crazy thoughts of a woman destroyed by grief. But I knew better. The pattern went back over 100 years. The Blackwood family in 1891, all found dead in their beds, no clear cause. The Mitchells in 1923, father discovered hanging in the attic, mother and twin daughters drowned in the upstairs bathtub. The Hendersons in 1934, entire family dead from what looked like poisoning, though no poison was ever found in their systems. Always the attic, always families with kids, always deaths that made no sense. The thing that lived in that house fed on fear and death, drawing victims upward to their doom. It had been doing it for generations, patient and hungry, waiting for the next family to move in, the next group of children to hear its call. But we hadn't lived there. We'd just been curious kids on a dare. I understood now why I'd been spared, not because I was special or deserving or braver than my friends. I'd been allowed to escape because my survival served a purpose. The thing needed a witness, someone to carry the story and the guilt, someone who would spend the rest of her life remembering what happened in that attic. The bear attack explanation had become local legend, repeated so often it became accepted truth. Detective Crawford had done his job well, creating a story people could live with. But I knew what really happened up there, and that knowledge had shaped every day of the last 30 years. I'd tried therapy, medication, support groups for trauma survivors. Nothing worked because I couldn't share the real story. Who would believe that 4 children had been murdered by something that shouldn't exist? That their friend had run away and abandoned them to die because she was too scared to climb a set of stairs? The relationships I'd attempted over the years all crashed the same way. Men who started out patient and understanding, who thought they could love me past my scars, eventually got tired of the nightmares and the emotional barriers I couldn't break down. David had lasted the longest, 3 years of marriage before he finally gave up. "It's like you're not really here," he'd said during our last fight. "Like part of you is still stuck in that house." He wasn't wrong. I dumped the cold coffee down the sink and made a fresh cup, my hands steady even as old memories came rushing back. The October light coming through my kitchen window had that same feel as 30 years ago. Golden and angled, hinting at the winter to come. Sometimes late at night when the apartment goes completely silent, I still sense it. That tugging feeling, weak but clear, like something reaching out to me across all those years. It reminds me that I got away once but might not be so lucky next time. The thing was patient. It could wait. I walked back to the living room and picked up Marshall's obituary again. His high school photo showed the same crooked grin I remembered, the same playful eyes that had pushed us all to be braver than we were. The boy who'd taken us into darkness, who'd climbed those attic stairs first while his voice grew flat and distant. "I'm sorry," I whispered to his picture. "I'm sorry I left you there." The words felt weak, the same apology I'd been giving for 30 years. Sorry for running. Sorry for surviving. Sorry for carrying this weight alone while they lay in the ground, their fear finally over. I closed the newspaper and walked to my bedroom, getting down beside the filing cabinet that held my research. At the very bottom, underneath all the historical documents and police reports, was a small wooden box my grandmother had given me when I was 7. Inside was a rosary, the beads worn smooth from decades of use, and a prayer card with faded edges. My grandmother had been Irish Catholic, full of stories about things that went bump in the night and the power of faith to hold them back. I pulled out the rosary and gripped it tight, the silver crucifix cool against my palm. Then I said the prayer she'd taught me, the same words I'd whispered that night when 4 12-year-olds decided to explore a haunted house and only one of them made it out alive. "Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil." The words felt empty in my quiet apartment, but I said them anyway. Because sometimes belief was all you had left, when everything else had been stripped away. And because somewhere out there, in whatever was left of that burned foundation on Elm Street, something was still waiting, still starving, still watching.